John Kennedy destroys Jamie Raskin on live TV. His career collapses in seconds. The studio lights burned hot, casting a sterile glow over the polished set of Truth or Tactics, Who Shapes the Narrative. The title alone was a provocation, a carefully crafted phrase designed to sound like an invitation to debate, but built to draw blood. The air was thick with the hum of anticipation, a low buzz of camera lenses, adjusting crew members whispering into headsets, and the faint rustle of cue cards being shuffled in the control booth above. This was no ordinary broadcast. It was a stage set for a spectacle, a live television event meant to dismantle its guest before an audience of millions. At the center of it all was Thupper Senator John Kennedy, invited as the evening's marquee guest, though he knew better than to believe the invitation was genuine. The show's host, Jamie Raskin, had a reputation for turning interviews into interrogations, his questions sharpened to cut through reputations with surgical precision. Tonight, the plan was clear to those behind the scenes. Kennedy would be the target, framed as a politician whose folksy charm masked a lack of substance, his record twisted into a caricature of inconsistency. The control room buzzed with quiet confidence. Producers exchanged knowing glances, their laptops open to pre-edited clips ready to roll at the perfect moment. This wasn't about dialogue. It was about destruction, a meticulously choreographed ambush dressed up as journalism. The goal was simple: corner Kennedy on live television, paint him as a relic out of touch with the modern political landscape, and let the viral clips do the rest. The audience, seated in neat rows under the glare of studio lights, had no idea what was coming. They'd been primed with warm-up banter, their laughter rehearsed by a stage manager who knew how to cue applause. To them, it would look like a debate, a clash of ideas. But to Raskin and his team, it was a trap set with the precision of a legal brief and the ruthlessness of a campaign ad. John Kennedy stepped into the studio through a private entrance, his presence unassuming yet deliberate. No entourage trailed him, no aides whispered last-minute talking points. He was alone, his suit a muted navy, his tie a simple red that didn't catch the light. In one hand, he carried a slim USB drive, its black casing unremarkable but heavy with intent. In the other, a thin folder, its edges crisp, its contents sealed tight. His face betrayed no nerves, no hesitation, just a quiet steadiness that seemed to absorb the frenetic energy of the studio rather than add to it. The producers watching him on the backstage monitor mistook his calm for unpreparedness. "He looks out of his depth," one muttered, smirking to another. They were wrong. Kennedy wasn't out of his depth. He was anchored, his mind sharp with the kind of clarity that comes from knowing exactly what you're walking into. He'd read the invitation the moment it arrived, saw the subtext buried in its polite phrasing. This wasn't a debate. It was a setup, a calculated attempt to reduce him to a soundbite, a meme, a punchline. But Kennedy hadn't risen to the Senate by accident. He'd faced tougher rooms than this courtroom's town hall's committee hearings, where every word was a potential landmine. He knew how to listen, how to wait, how to let an opponent's overconfidence become their own unraveling. The studio itself was a machine, every detail engineered to amplify the host's control. The set was designed to intimidate with its sleek black desk, elevated just enough to give Raskin the high ground, his chair angled to face the guest like a prosecutor staring down a witness. The cameras were positioned to catch every flinch, every bead of sweat, their lenses trained on Kennedy's seat before he even sat down. Behind the desk, a massive screen loomed ready to flash images and clips that would frame the narrative before Kennedy could open his mouth. The audience, carefully curated, sat primed to react on cue, their responses shaped by the warm-up act's instructions to clap, laugh, or gasp at the right moments. The control booth above was the nerve center, a hive of screens and headsets, where producers orchestrated the show like a chess game, every move planned, every counter-move anticipated. They'd spent days preparing for this, combing through Kennedy's public record, pulling quotes out of context, editing speeches to make his measured drawl sound erratic, his principles sound like platitudes. They had a highlight reel ready, a montage of moments designed to paint him as a man whose charm couldn't hide his contradictions. It wasn't enough to challenge him. They wanted to bury him, to make him a cautionary tale for anyone who dared step into their arena without bowing to their rules. Raskin sat at his desk, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, scanning the room with the confidence of a man who'd never lost on his own turf. His suit was tailored, his tie a bold blue that popped under the lights, a deliberate contrast to Kennedy's understated presence. He shuffled his notes, though he barely needed them. The questions were memorized, each one a blade disguised as curiosity, crafted to provoke a reaction that could be clipped and shared before the broadcast even ended. Raskin's team had spent weeks dissecting Kennedy's career, not to understand him, but to weaponize him. They'd found speeches where his humor landed wrong votes that could be spun as inconsistent, and offhand remarks that, stripped of context, could be made to look reckless. The plan was to hit him early, keep him off balance, and let the audience's laughter do the rest. Raskin leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He didn't need to raise his voice. His power was in his control, in the way he could frame a question to sound neutral while landing like an accusation. He'd done this before, turned guests into caricatures, their words twisted into traps they couldn't escape. Tonight, he was certain, would be no different. Backstage, Kennedy stood in the shadows, watching the final preparations unfold. A stagehand offered him a bottle of water, but he declined with a polite nod, his eyes fixed on the set. He'd seen the promos for the show, the slick ads that promised a no-holds-barred debate, but hinted at something uglier. He knew the game. He'd watched Raskin's show enough to recognize the pattern guests invited under the guise of fairness, only to be ambushed with selective edits and loaded questions. He'd seen colleagues walk off that stage, diminished their words, mangled their reputations, bruised. But Kennedy wasn't like them. He didn't come to perform. He came to confront not with theatrics, but with truth, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. The USB in his pocket felt like a small weight, a reminder of what he'd brought with him. The folder in his hand was insurance, its pages filled with evidence he'd gathered, not in a rush but over months, knowing a moment like this might come. He didn't tell his staff he was coming. He didn't consult advisors. He'd made the decision alone, accepting the invitation with a single phone call, his voice steady, his intentions clear. This wasn't about winning a debate. It was about exposing a lie, one that had been dressed up as entertainment for too long. The red on-air sign flickered to life, a silent signal that the game was about to begin. The studio hum shifted no longer, just the background noise of production, but a rising pulse, as if the room itself sensed the weight of what was coming. The audience settled their chatter, fading into an expectant hush. Raskin adjusted his tie, his smile tightening as he glanced at the teleprompter, the opening lines already loaded. Kennedy took his seat across from him, his movements unhurried, his expression unreadable. He set the folder on the table, the USB beside it, and both items innocuous to the untrained eye but loaded with intent. The cameras zoomed in, catching the faint glint of light off the USB's casing, the crisp edge of the folder under Kennedy's steady hand. Raskin leaned forward, his voice smooth, practiced, welcoming. "Senator Kennedy, thank you for joining us tonight." He began, his tone warm, but laced with something sharper, something that promised This would be no ordinary exchange. Let's start with a simple question. The screen behind them flickered, ready to roll the first clip, a carefully edited moment from Kennedy's past designed to set the tone. The audience leaned in, unaware they were watching the opening move of a trap. But Kennedy's eyes didn't waver. He looked at Raskin not with defiance, but with certainty, the kind that comes from knowing the truth is heavier than any script. The room was set, the lights were on, and the trap was sprung. But what Raskin didn't know, what no one in that studio knew, was that John Kennedy wasn't there to play their game. He was there to change it. The studio lights seemed to sharpen as the red on-air sign burned steadily above, casting a clinical glow over the set of Truth or Tactics, Who Shapes the Narrative. The audience sat on edge, their earlier laughter now replaced by a tense hush, sensing the shift in the air as Jamie Raskin leaned forward, his smile tight but confident. He'd just thrown his opening salvo, a question laced with accusation, disguised as curiosity. Senator Kennedy, your record shows a pattern of shifting positions, some might say, flip-flopping to appeal to the moment. Is that leadership, or is it just playing to the crowd? The words were deliberate, designed to sting, to provoke a defensive stumble that could be clipped and shared before the commercial break. Behind Raskin, the massive screen flared to life, rolling a montage of carefully curated moments from Kennedy's career. A grainy clip from a town hall showed him joking about bureaucracy, the punchline cut to sound dismissive. Another from a Senate hearing had his drawl slowed, his words spliced to suggest indecision. The edits were seamless, professional, ruthless, each frame chosen to paint him as a man whose charm masked a lack of conviction. The audience stirred, a few chuckles rippling through the crowd, prompted by the stage manager's subtle nod from the sidelines. Raskin let the clip linger, his eyes never leaving Kennedy's face, waiting for the flinch, the sweat, the crack in composure that would hand him the moment. He didn't get it. John Kennedy sat still, his hands resting lightly on the folder in front of him, his expression calm, almost serene. His gaze met Raskin's, steady and unblinking, as if he'd seen the trap coming long before the cameras started rolling. The silence stretched just long enough to unsettle the room, the kind of pause that made producers in the control booth shift uncomfortably in their seats. Raskin pressed on undeterred, his voice smooth, but edged with a prosecutor's precision. "Senator, you've built a reputation on folksy anecdotes. But when the cameras are off, do you stand by the principles you sell to your constituents, or is it all just a performance?" The question wasn't meant to be answered. It was meant to wound, to frame Kennedy as a political opportunist whose Southern charm was a mask for inconsistency. The screen shifted again this time, showing a freeze frame of Kennedy mid-speech. His hands raised, his face caught in a moment that looked like exasperation, but was really just emphasis stripped of context by clever editing. The audience murmured some nodding, as if the image confirmed their doubts. Raskin leaned back, his smile widening, certain he'd landed the first blow. The control booth buzzed with activity producers signaling Camera 3 to zoom in on Kennedy's face, ready to capture the moment he faltered. But Kennedy didn't falter. Instead, a slow, almost imperceptible smile curved the corner of his mouth, not mocking, not theatrical, but the kind of smile that comes from knowing something your opponent doesn't. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady, his Louisiana drawl deliberate, but unhurried. "Jamie, if you're gonna play clips, let's play the whole thing. Context matters. Or don't you believe in that?" The line wasn't loud, but it cut through the studio like a blade, quiet and precise. The audience stilled their murmurs, fading. Raskin's smile flickered, just for a second, a crack in his polished facade. The control booth hesitated, unsure whether to follow the script or brace for something unplanned. Kennedy didn't wait for permission. He reached for the USB drive on the table, its black casing catching the light, as he held it up briefly, not for drama, but for clarity. "I brought something for you," he said, his tone conversational, almost gentle, but with an undercurrent of steel. "It's a video, unedited, 90 seconds. Let's roll it." He slid the USB across the table toward Raskin, who froze, his hand hovering over his notes as if unsure whether to take it. The producer in the booth barked into the headset, "We didn't clear this. Stall him." But the stagehand, caught off guard by Kennedy's calm authority, had already taken the USB and was moving toward the control table. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier, as if the studio itself was holding its breath. Raskin tried to regain control, his voice sharp but strained. "Senator, we're here to discuss your record, not play games with unscreened footage." But Kennedy didn't budge. He raised a single finger, not in anger but in command, his eyes locked on Raskin's. "You wanted truth, Jamie. This is it. Play the file." The producer in the booth hesitated, glancing at the director, who shook his head, but the stagehand was already plugging the USB into the system. The screen flickered, then came alive with a raw, unpolished feed. The timestamp was vague, but the setting was unmistakable. A backstage moment from Raskin's show, captured after a broadcast had ended. Raskin, unaware the camera was still rolling, leaned back in his chair, pulling off his mic. A production assistant asked, "Do we need to fact-check that last segment?" Raskin laughed, a tired, dismissive sound, and said, "Fact-checking's for amateurs. If it trends, it's true enough." The words hung in the air, casual but damning a glimpse into a mindset that valued attention over accuracy. The studio went silent. Not the awkward silence of a missed cue, but the heavy, absolute stillness of a room confronting something it wasn't meant to see. The audience, so quick to laugh minutes before, sat frozen, their faces a mix of shock and unease. Raskin's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to the screen, then back to Kennedy, searching for a way to spin what had just been revealed. The control booth erupted in chaos, voices overlapping in headsets, a director shouting to cut to commercial, another yelling to keep the feed live. But no one moved to stop it. The clip played on, looping Raskin's words, each repetition landing harder than the last. Kennedy didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He leaned back in his chair, his hands folded over the folder, his expression unchanged. "That's your truth, Jamie," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of the moment. "You invited me here to talk about principles. Let's talk about yours." The line wasn't a shout, but it echoed, slicing through the studio's manufactured tension. Raskin opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. His hands gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles pale, his confidence unraveling in real time. The camera, operating on instinct, zoomed in, not on Kennedy, but on Raskin's face, catching the flicker of uncertainty, the subtle clench of his jaw. The audience didn't clap. They didn't murmur. They watched, their silence no longer curated, but raw, as if they'd just seen the curtain pulled back on a performance they'd been sold as reality. Kennedy wasn't done. He tapped the folder in front of him, a deliberate motion that drew every eye in the room. "There's more," he said, his voice still calm, still measured, but now carrying a quiet authority that made the producers in the booth flinch. "Emails, internal ones, from your team. Want to guess what they say about how you pick your guests?" Raskin's face drained of color, his earlier smirk gone, replaced by a look that was equal parts rage and panic. He tried to interrupt, his voice rising. "This is a stunt, Senator. You're deflecting from the real issue, your record." But Kennedy didn't take the bait. He opened the folder, revealing a single sheet, its text highlighted in bold yellow. "This one's from you, Jamie. To your senior producer. You called a guest, someone like me, a ratings grab." Chere said it didn't matter what they believed as long as they got people talking. Sound familiar? The audience shifted, a low gasp rippling through the crowd. Raskin's eyes darted to the control booth, searching for rescue. But none came. The cameras stayed on the feed unbroken, the truth spilling out faster than anyone could edit it. Kennedy didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture wildly. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than any outburst ever could, and the studio, for the first time that night, belonged to him. The studio lights didn't flicker, but they seemed to dim under the weight of the moment, as if the very atmosphere of truth or tactics, who shapes the narrative, had shifted irreversibly. The massive screen behind Jamie Raskin was dark now, the unedited clip of his backstage confession, fact-checkings for amateurs. If it trends, it's true enough, still echoing in the minds of everyone in the room. The audience sat frozen, their earlier laughter replaced by a stunned silence, the kind that settles when a truth, too raw to ignore, breaks through the polish of a broadcast. John Kennedy, seated across from Raskin, remained composed, his hands resting lightly on the folder he'd just opened, its single highlighted page, still visible the words, "Ratings grab," burning brighter than the studio's overheads. Raskin's face, once a mask of practiced confidence, was now a study in fracture, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between Kennedy, the audience, and the control booth above, searching for an exit that didn't exist. The producers in the booth were scrambling their voices, a chaotic hum through headsets barking conflicting orders. Cut to break. No, keep it live. Get him out of frame. But the cameras stayed on their lenses, locked on the unfolding drama, as if even the machinery knew this was no longer Raskin's show. Kennedy had turned the trap inside out, and what was meant to be his public dismantling had become Raskin's reckoning. Raskin tried to regain control, his voice rising sharp but unsteady. "Senator, this is a distraction," he said, leaning forward, his hands gripping the desk as if to anchor himself. "You're dodging the real issue, your inconsistent record. Let's stay on topic." The words were meant to sound authoritative, but they landed hollow like a script read by someone who no longer believed it. The audience didn't react. No applause, no murmurs, just a heavy stillness that seemed to press against Raskin's every syllable. Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or shift in his seat. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes steady, his Louisiana drawl slow and deliberate. "Jamie, you wanted to talk about truth. I'm just giving you what you asked for." The line was simple, but it cut deeper than any shout, its calm certainty exposing the hollowness of Raskin's deflection. Kennedy reached for the folder again, his movements unhurried, almost methodical, as if he were presenting evidence in a courtroom rather than a studio. He pulled out a second sheet, its edges crisp, its text marked with the same bold yellow highlights. "This is another email," he said, his voice low, but carrying the weight of absolute clarity. "From you to your executive producer sent 3 weeks ago. You wrote, and I quote, 'Pick guests who'll stir the pot. Doesn't matter if they're right, just make sure they're loud.' That's not a debate strategy, Jamie. That's a business plan." The audience gasped, a sharp intake of breath that rippled through the room like a wave. Raskin's face drained of color, his hands twitching slightly on the desk, betraying the panic he was trying to mask. The control booth was in chaos now, the director's voice cracking over the headsets. "Kill the feed. Go to commercial." But no one moved to pull the plug. The stagehand who'd plugged in Kennedy's USB stood frozen, his eyes wide, as if realizing he'd unwittingly set off a detonation. The screen behind Raskin flickered again this time, displaying a screenshot of the email Kennedy had just quoted, the text blown up for the world to see. The words were undeniable, their black and white clarity a stark contrast to the studio's glossy production. Raskin opened his mouth to respond, but his voice faltered a weak, "This is out of context," slipping out before he could stop himself. The audience didn't buy it. A low murmur started in the back row, not of agreement, but of disbelief, as if the room was waking up to the reality they'd been sold as entertainment. Kennedy didn't press. He didn't need to. He set the email down on the desk, placing it deliberately in front of Raskin, not as a challenge, but as a fact, unignorable and uneditable. "You invited me here to talk about principles," Kennedy said, his tone still calm, still grounded, but now laced with a quiet resolve that made the room feel smaller. "But it seems like your principles are whatever keeps the cameras rolling." The line landed like a gavel, not loud, but final, and the silence that followed was no longer just stunned. It was accusatory, as if the audience was now judging the man who'd been judging Kennedy moments before. Raskin's composure was unraveling his polished facade, cracking under the weight of his own words. He tried to pivot, his voice rising again, this time with a hint of desperation. "Senator, you're trying to turn this into a circus. The American people want answers, not theatrics." But the words sounded rehearsed, a line from a playbook that no longer worked. The audience wasn't clapping anymore. The stage manager's cues went ignored, the laughter track that had been so carefully curated now absent. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his hands folded, his expression unchanged. "A circus, Jamie, you built this tent. I'm just shining a light on it." The metaphor was simple, but it hit hard, drawing a scattered chuckle from the audience, not the prompted kind, but the real kind. The kind that comes when someone names a truth everyone recognizes but no one dared say. Raskin's eyes flashed with something close to rage, but it was tempered by fear, the kind that comes when you realize the narrative you've controlled for years is slipping through your fingers. He tried to interrupt, his voice overlapping Kennedy's, but the senator didn't budge. He raised a single hand, not to silence, but to pause, his authority quiet, but unshakable. "Let me finish," he said, his drawl carrying a weight that made even the producers in the booth hesitate. "You've had your turn, now it's mine." Kennedy opened the folder again, this time pulling out a third document. Its pages stapled, its contents marked with a precision that suggested months of preparation. "This one's not an email," he said, his voice steady, almost conversational, but with an edge that cut through the room's tension. "It's a memo from your team to the network's legal department dated last month. It's about a guest you had on last year, a professor who challenged your narrative on air. You called her disruptive in this memo and suggested she be blacklisted from future segments. Why, because she asked for evidence and you didn't have it. That's not journalism, Jamie, that's control." The audience shifted, a low hum of discomfort spreading through the crowd. The camera zoomed in on the memo, its text clear under the studio lights, the word blacklist circled in red ink. Raskin's hands were shaking now, not visibly to the audience, but enough for the camera to catch the faint tremor as he reached for his water glass, only to pull back without drinking. He tried to speak, his voice hoarse. "This is a smear, Senator. You're cherry-picking documents to make me look bad." But Kennedy didn't take the bait. He set the memo down beside the email, his movements deliberate, his eyes locked on Raskin's. "I'm not cherry-picking, Jamie. I'm quoting you. If that makes you look bad, maybe it's time to look in the mirror." The room was no longer a studio. It was a courtroom, and Kennedy was no longer just a guest. He was the one asking the questions now, his calm authority turning the tables on a host who'd built his career on controlling the narrative. The audience was no longer passive. They were witnesses, their silence a mix of shock and realization, as if they'd just seen the machinery behind the show they'd been watching for years. The control booth was in full panic, the director shouting for a hard cut, but the feed stayed live, the cameras refusing to blink. Outside the studio, the world was already reacting. Phones in the audience buzzed as clips of Kennedy's revelations were ripped and shared, hashtags like #Raskin exposed starting to trend before the segment even ended. Raskin tried one last time to salvage the moment, his voice rising to a near shout. "This is about accountability, Senator. The people deserve to know who's shaping their narrative." But the irony was too stark, and Kennedy didn't let it pass. "You're right, Jamie," he said, his voice still calm, still cutting. "And tonight, they're finding out." The line was a knockout, not because it was loud, but because it was true, and no amount of editing could bury it. The fallout was immediate. As the segment ended, the screen faded to black, but the tension didn't lift. Raskin stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor, and walked off the set without a word. His face pale, his steps uneven. The audience didn't clap. They didn't boo. They just watched, their silence louder than any reaction the producers could have scripted. In the control booth, the chaos continued, with producers scrambling to draft a statement to spin the disaster into something salvageable. But it was too late. The truth had gone live, and it was moving faster than their damage control. Kennedy remained seated, his folder closed, his USB still on the table, his expression unchanged. He didn't gloat or grandstand. He didn't need to. The evidence had spoken, and the studio, once Raskin's domain, now felt like it belonged to someone else. Outside, the internet was exploding clips of Raskin's confession, and Kennedy's calm dismantling spreading like wildfire. Sponsors were already pulling back their PR teams, issuing vague statements about reevaluating partnerships. Raskin's name was trending, but not in the way he'd planned. And Kennedy, the man they'd invited to discredit, had just turned their stage into a mirror reflecting a truth they couldn't hide. The studio lights had long since dimmed the set of Truth or Tactics, Who Shapes the Narrative. Now a silent relic of the confrontation that had unraveled it. Jamie Raskin's abrupt exit from the stage marked the end of his broadcast that night, but it was only the beginning of a seismic shift that rippled far beyond the studio walls. John Kennedy, still seated as the cameras cut to black, had not raised his voice, had not gloated, had not chased the spotlight. He'd simply presented the truth, unfiltered, unedited, undeniable, and let it do the work. The folder and USB drive, once unassuming props on the desk, had become instruments of clarity, exposing Raskin's calculated manipulation through his own words, a backstage confession that fact-checkings for amateurs, emails labeling guests as ratings grabs, and a memo advocating blacklisting those who dared challenge the narrative. The audience, once primed to laugh on cue, had left the studio not with applause, but with a quiet unease, their phones already buzzing with clips they'd recorded, shared, and dissected before the broadcast even ended. Outside, the world was moving, and the truth Kennedy had laid bare was no longer confined to a single stage. It was alive, spreading, reshaping how people saw not just Raskin, but the machinery of media itself. And in that transformation lay a lesson, one that would outlast the viral moment and become a legacy of its own. The fallout was swift and unforgiving. By the time the studio's lights cooled, social media was ablaze. Hashtags like #Raskin exposed and #Truth. Matters trended within minutes, not just in political circles, but across cities, demographics, and platforms. Clips of Kennedy's calm delivery juxtaposed against Raskin's faltering deflections were shared millions of times, each view amplifying the moment when the host's own words turned against him. One post from a former guest on Raskin's show went viral, with over 2 million views in an hour. I was told to keep it spicy for ratings. Kennedy just showed us what happens when you bring facts instead. The public's reaction wasn't just outrage, it was recognition, a collective awakening to the tactics used to shape their perceptions. Major sponsors, sensing the shift, moved quickly. 2 financial firms and a tech company released statements within hours, their language polished but clear. We are reviewing our advertising commitments in light of recent events. The subtext was unmistakable. Raskin's show, once a profitable engine of controversy, had become a liability. Inside the network, executives huddled in emergency meetings, their PR team drafting statements that never saw the light of day. The problem wasn't just Raskin's exposure. It was the clarity with which Kennedy had revealed the system behind him, a system that thrived on distortion, but crumbled under scrutiny. Raskin's absence was immediate and stark. The following week, viewers tuned in to Truth or Tactics, expecting a fiery rebuttal or a carefully scripted apology. Instead, they found a substitute host, a mid-level anchor with a neutral tone and a pre-approved script, introducing topics with none of Raskin's bravado. The network offered only a vague explanation: Jamie Raskin is off this evening. We'll return to regular programming soon. But soon never came. Raskin's social media accounts, once a flurry of bold takes and promotional posts, went silent. His team deleted scheduled tweets, canceled guest appearances, and postponed a planned book tour. Insiders whispered of a network in crisis, not because Raskin had been suspended, but because he'd become untouchable. His chair wasn't just empty, it was radioactive, a symbol of a brand that could no longer afford to be associated with him. Media outlets reported on the silence, noting that Raskin hadn't been fired or placed on leave. He'd simply vanished, his absence a louder confession than any statement could have been. For a man who'd built a career on commanding attention, the void he left spoke volumes, a testament to the power of truth when it's allowed to stand unedited. Kennedy, by contrast, didn't chase the spotlight. He returned to his Senate work without fanfare, declining interview requests from major networks and talk shows. When a prominent journalist pressed for a comment, he responded with a single sentence: "I didn't come to make noise. I came to make things clear." That clarity became his legacy, not just in the viral clips, but in the way his actions reshaped conversations. Universities began incorporating the confrontation into media studies courses, professors calling it a masterclass in rhetorical discipline. A journalism instructor at Georgetown described it as the moment when preparation met principle, and the room had to listen. Students analyzed Kennedy's body language, his steady gaze, his deliberate pauses, the way he let evidence speak louder than emotion. Civil society groups took note too. A coalition of media watchdogs issued a statement praising Kennedy's approach not as a political victory but as a defense of integrity. What we saw was not a takedown, but a restoration of accountability. The moment wasn't just about one man's exposure. It was about showing what happens when truth is given airtime instead of applause. The lesson, though, was deeper than media ethics. It was human, rooted in the quiet strength Kennedy displayed when every element of the studio, the lights, the cameras, the edited clips, was designed to diminish him. He'd walked into a trap knowing it was there, not because he sought confrontation, but because he understood that truth, when backed by evidence and delivered with resolve, could dismantle even the most carefully constructed narrative. That lesson resonated with millions who'd watched the clips not just for the drama, but for what they revealed about resilience. For every person who'd been talked over in a meeting, dismissed in a debate, or reduced to a caricature in a headline, Kennedy's composure was a blueprint. He didn't shout. He didn't grandstand. He brought receipts, emails, memos, a video clip, and let them speak. And in doing so, he showed that power isn't always in volume. Sometimes, it's in the refusal to be anything less than honest, even when the room is stacked against you. This wasn't just a lesson for the audience, it was a call to action. Across platforms, people began demanding more transparency in media, sharing hashtags like #uneditedtruth and calling for networks to disclose how they edit guest appearances. A group of young journalists launched a podcast called No Cuts, dissecting how shows like Raskin's used selective framing to shape narratives. Their first episode, downloaded thousands of times, broke down the camera angles and interruptions used against Kennedy in past appearances, contrasting them with the uninterrupted clarity of his confrontation. In classrooms, students debated the ethics of gotcha journalism, using Kennedy's evidence as a case study in accountability. Even in workplaces far removed from politics, employees began questioning how their own voices were framed, how their words were edited in reports or meetings. Kennedy's moment had done more than expose Raskin. It had given people permission to notice the traps set for them, to demand the full story, to refuse to be reduced to a soundbite. The legacy wasn't in the headlines or the hashtags, though they carried the story far. It was in the shift they sparked, a quiet but seismic change in how people saw the interplay of truth and power. Kennedy didn't need to take a victory lap. His work was done the moment he walked off the stage, leaving behind a room that could no longer pretend it hadn't seen what it saw. The network scrambled to contain the fallout, issuing new guidelines for guest segments, no pre-edited clips without consent, no off-camera coaching during breaks, no framing guests as props for ratings. The policy wasn't announced publicly, but it leaked a silent admission that Kennedy's truth had forced a reckoning. Other networks took notice, pausing similar shows, wary of replicating Raskin's mistake. The public, too, was different now. They watched with sharper eyes, noticing when a guest was interrupted, when a clip felt too polished, when a question was more accusation than inquiry. They'd seen what truth looked like when it wasn't clipped, when it wasn't staged, when it was simply allowed to stand. The human lesson was the heart of it all. Kennedy's victory wasn't just in outsmarting Raskin or exposing a flawed system. It was in showing what it means to stand your ground when the odds are engineered against you. For every person who'd been told to soften their voice, to temper their truth, to smile through misrepresentation, Kennedy's calm resolve was a reminder: you don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to fight to be right. You just have to be prepared to bring the facts, to refuse, to bend under pressure. That's what made the moment endure, not the drama, but the dignity. It was a lesson in survival, in holding fast to integrity when the world expects you to crumble. And it was a lesson for everyone, watching a call to carry that same clarity into their own battles, to demand truth, not just from media, but from themselves. Kennedy's legacy wasn't in the studio he left behind, but in the millions who walked away seeing the world a little clearer, ready to hold their own ground, unedited and unafraid.